I will start out with a few questions, and then we can open it up to the audience. We don't have a ton of time, so I do want to make sure that we can take some questions from out there. But I mean, there are many striking and surprising layers in this film that I hope we can touch on. But I guess I want to start with the structure of the film, which immediately struck me when watching it. I mean, it's a film in two parts. The title doesn't show up till about a quarter of the way in, and so I'm wondering if you can just talk a little bit about that decision, how just why you chose to tell these two stories this way.
Well, the first big trigger for the film itself was the realization that there was a kind of resurgence of extreme right-wing ideas and of the alt-right all over the world, a sort of resurgence, reappearance of these ideals even in younger people, and how it was somehow shaping society into a much more or a much less free and permissive and open society than the one that we have somehow tried to create. So suddenly, it felt to me like the world was becoming full of walls, and these walls are the ideas, the old ideas that seem to come back when we thought that they had already been surpassed, you know? When the structure for the film and the core surprise of the film came to me, it became clear that we were talking about a film concerning the past and the present. So what happens in the structure of the film is that if I look at it in an academic way, I would say that perhaps the film is a 3-act structure with a prologue. And so the option to place the title at that particular moment may somehow be seen as an affected, as an if what's the word, like I would say perhaps a snobbish option, or it's like an effect. Yeah, okay, so I was right. Okay, option, but to me it was clear that we were. It's almost like going from minus 20, minus 19, minus 18, minus 17, till you get to 0, and then starting the +1, +2, +3. And because we're talking about chronology as well, so my idea with this with the structure was also to put my efforts in creating a first prologue that was deliberately hazy and not as narrative, not as deliberately based on cause and effect, because somehow the structure of the film should mirror the process of writing history itself, the way we understand and start to realize the meanings of things almost 10 years after, or 20 years after. Like right now, for example, we're probably capable of discerning and understanding thought processes and events of 20 years ago, and calling it a name and saying if it was right or wrong. I don't know, maybe more than we were before. So it's almost like if history happens, but we're only later able to look back at it and make some sort of judgment out of it, make some sort of appreciation, or some or understand it completely. I'm sorry, maybe I'm walking around the idea, but maybe I don't know if I'm.
Well, I guess I mean you were born in Angola, and you spent, from what I understand, your formative years between there and Portugal, and so I guess with to follow on what you've already been saying, I'm just curious how you developed the idea with the things that were happening around you, but also how your own perspective and how your own background sort of informed your writing process with the story.
Yes, I mean, I lived in Angola till I was 22, but always had communication and recurrent presence in Portugal. And then I moved to Portugal to study film, where I've been based for the past 21 years. So this is pretty much a story that a circumstance or a set of circumstances that has belonged to my household in a way, you know, the relationship with both countries. But the real trigger for the film was to talk about was to talk more about Portugal than to talk about Angola. It was to talk about how these walls, the ideas, the old ideas that I was talking about before, how they still are so present in the society, in the Portuguese society, and how in every single place of the world they may represent a threat when they're brought back. So let's say that looking back at Portuguese history, it's impossible to talk about the Portuguese fascism without talking about the process of the decolonization of countries like Mozambique, Angola, Cape Verde, and Saint Tomé, and Guinea, for example. My relationship in particular is with Angola. And as I was saying, it's quite difficult to dissociate the one and the other, the colonization process and the fascism, the period of fascism, because it is exactly at the moment in which the fascism falls in 1974 that at last the last colonies get their independence. And also the final wars of the final years of the colonial presence of Portugal in Angola have been quite bloody ones. You know, they were 15, 13, 14 years, I think, of very intense war. And when in this film we look back at those ideas, at those times, I think it's quite difficult to actually say this is not a consequent or a cause for the other.
João, you have been working with Carlos. I mean, you've been working together for many years now, and so I'm curious if you can recall your first encounter with this idea, if it was something Carlos had described to you, or if you didn't really know what this film was until you'd read the script.
First of all, hello everyone. Well, Carlos and I are very close friends, so we spend a lot of time together. And Carlos has a lot of ideas, so we are always talking about his ideas and the ideas of future movies. So I don't remember when was the first time that we talked about this movie, but
Me neither.
probably at a dinner party somewhere. I think that's it. I can't remember when, but
well, what was your initial reaction to the premise or this?
It's amazing. I'm not even kidding. Especially, like Carlos said, the right-wing parties are reappearing everywhere in Portugal as well, in Europe, here. So I think it's a crucial project, and I think it's very interesting. And well, in a nutshell, I think it's a great idea, and I was super thrilled and excited to be a part of it.
There is actually, it's when João says that he doesn't remember, I also don't remember, because this project has existed for, I would say, perhaps 10 years, and this was the time it took for the film to get financed somehow. At a certain moment, I associated the project to Terra Trem, who's represented here by Leonor Noivo.
Woohoo!
And the thing is that only then we found way to finance the film through the Portuguese Institute of Cinema. But the thing is also that as the years passed, it seemed like there was always a new reason happening in the world for the film to be made, you know? And I personally thought, okay, yeah, we should be doing that film. We should be doing that film. And so I also hope that because of that, in a few years, now that the film is done, it will still resonate somehow. Because I have trust that this cyclical ideas, the cyclicity of the ideas is not something that's going to finish like that. So I think we have to learn to deal with it, with the resurgence of those ghosts from the past.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I'm curious how this film did evolve over the course of 10 years, and I guess, namely, I'm curious to look at that question through how you bring in so many different genre elements, and you're balancing so many different tones, especially in I guess the main part of the film. I think like that this whole storyline in there, the contact points between, I think, the war film, the zombie or ghost story, even comedy. I think those contact points are very blurred, and I think add to the kind of disorienting atmosphere to the film. So I'm wondering what appealed to you, or what appealed to you about working with these certain genre traditions and kind of blending them.
I consider myself a serious cinephile, so sometimes it's a matter of temptation. You know, you have this idea that you're working on, and because you're working with codes, with cinema codes, with cinematic codes, that somehow sprout into different genres and subgenres, you kind of tend to feel tempted to adopt to go a certain way, to have this. I wouldn't say to give a wink towards a certain direction and cinematic tradition, but I don't think certain options make a film. I wouldn't say this is a zombie film or a war film alone. I think it should be seen as a film that actually involves elements of all of those traditions without necessarily being committed to anyone. I think genre is a set of it's a lexicon or a set of lexicons that people tend to somehow relate to in order to recognize their own ground, the ground they're standing on. We know from horror films, like from our horror films of the 80s, we are used to recognize the elements that ultimately we started to call cliches, for example. So my idea with those elements was not to create a genre exercise or a tribute to different genres, but to use cinematic traditions as an everyday tool to tell a story, because so is life. I think life is all full of different elements, some things that make you laugh, some things that make you cry, some things that scare you to death, and of course, in literature, you would be using more or less poetic prose, more or less scientific texts to convey your ideas. And in film, we have those traditions, we have those conventions somehow.
So how did these ideas that you're talking about sort of filter into the way you thought about, I guess, performance, for example? I mean, what kind of conversations were you and João having about, just performance in general? Because I think, João, your role is very physical. I mean, there isn't a ton of dialogue in the film. I think so much of it relies on physical action and gesture.
Ultimately, during the filming, I realized how much this was an action film, like in inverted commas, because it was somehow more. It was a story that was ultimately told by movement and by the dance between the actors and the camera, more than it was about different layers in the characters. So somehow my approach to working with the actors was to cast them before I finished writing or before any major rewrite, so that I could somehow get the characters from them, you know, and make the most out of their personal characteristics, of their personal natural gestures, and allow that to build the characters, instead of telling them, okay, you have this past psychology, you have this event that traumatized you, and this and that. And so I don't really talk very much to the actors on the set, but I believe that, like, while we're preparing a film, for like the year that precedes the shoot, it's possible that we end up talking about it every day,
Yeah.
and it kind of then stays in the subconscious of us, of all of us, and that becomes our sort of raw material in the end. I'm sorry, I didn't want to steal your your answer.
Go for it.
No, it's just because it's a dual perspective.
Yeah, no, yeah, sure. I'd love to hear your perspective on this, and I guess also like, yeah, what did you see as you were going into the role? Like, what were the most challenging aspects of the performance?
To be honest, I don't know how to answer that question, but I think a good thing about working with Carlos is that he really understands the project, and well, I just trust him, basically. He tells me to do something, and I know, okay, even though I don't understand why I'm doing this, I completely trust you. I will go with it.
It's not like I leave the actors blind, in the dark. But very
No,
very
not at
often,
all.
there were occasions in this film and in other films in which an actor asks me, "What exactly is what am I thinking when I do this?" And with all respect that I have for the acting, for the art, the amazing art of acting, I think that some shots are just a person walking from a door to a window. And that's it. I mean, it's others can be a mountain of complications and a real puzzle to solve, somehow, because very often we can be dealing with emotions that are not verbalizable, because I'm not going to tell an actor what he or she feels. What I'm interested in is to see what the actor discovers that he or she will feel from that particular premise, from that particular situation. But not all scenes are so, full of emotions to dissect. Sometimes it's just mere movement. And personally, I'm a fan of the contained acting somehow. So very often I tend to ask my actors to underplay the scenes a bit. This film is a mix of a lot of things, but anyway.
Well, I'm curious how I'll just ask one more question, then we can take one or two questions from the audience if there are any. But I guess I'm just wondering how this sort of kind of adaptive process that you're talking about sort of was reflected in the sort of the look of the film, and like what kind of conversations you were having with your cinematographer about just the visual language, and especially like between these two parts, how you thought of making these two visually distinctive sequences.
Well, Vasco is here, our cinematographer, so maybe he can also...
You can join us.
Maybe he can add a lot more to that answer than I would. Usually what I do is we shy a little bit away from we run away from references from other films somehow. So very often we talk about painting and usually about the scene, not about the shot. For this film in particular, he was working with models and 3D reproductions of the. Okay, I'll let you.
Yeah, we did some maquettes because it was kind of epic to light some of the sets. But regarding references, I love working with Carlos because he has a vision that's so specific that and I know him from 20 years, and we did a lot of projects together. And there is a point where
what do
you
mean
get
20 years.
18 years or something. It's true, we have to admit we're getting younger. But it's one of the most specific aspects of working with this guy, because nowadays there seems to be a tendency to reference a lot of stuff, especially other films. And with Carlos and me, I think the process was much more about maybe talking a bit about painting and just general concepts, and a bit more, a more mysterious even conversations we had about this project. And also for me, also watching the film coming together in the first few days and starting to really respect what Carlos was doing with the camera, and then just following up. And then also underplay a bit the cinematography to kind of not over, not, I think we try to more or less get to an equilibrium between referencing some Jacques Tourneur or something like that, some Fritz Lang, or, more expressionist lighting approaches, and also underplaying a bit of that. And also we didn't go too much into overly reference, also something that's a bit in vogue, which is referencing, stealing a bit from like retro-looking films or something like that, or very strong colors or something like that. We kind of
going for a sort of a very vintage feel to the mood. But still, it's interesting that you were mentioning Jacques Tourneur, because what we talked about Jacques Tourneur was basically black and white. And it was at a certain point, it was the only cinematic reference that we ended up embracing. Vasco was watching, I think it was I Walk with the Zombie, because it was the immediate choice. And we had this understanding of how he, in his films, was using the colorist.
dappled lighting. It's something that we
just like always to point the light through leaves or through some texture, some sort of.
Which is something I have been trying to bring to the table in every Carlos film. Bad Bunny is a very good example of that. We try to use that technique also, and especially, most of all, Carlos was very adamant. Very strongly convicted about really making sure that this was not to be confounded in the first, to establish that this film would be not so much a naturalistic film from the get-go to the viewer. So there was also a bit of like a construction into this more artificial, maybe it's not the best word.
Even in the first part, you were asking about the approach to the prologue as in reference to the, let's call it like the body. It's almost like, I feel like it's like a head and then a body. But we never talked about making it look different. It actually, there are certain differences that that come from the how we were working with. They come from the it was. It had to do with the light of different countries as well. They had to do with the nature. They had to do with the use of gimbal versus the use of tracks for tracking shots. So there's a subtlety somehow in the language of the first half in relation to the second one, but I would say that while the second half is overly non-naturalistic, the first one is perhaps spiked with bits of realism, and not the nights or anything like that. But the idea was almost that we would be starting in a sort of a documentary observation of a certain circumstance, just by feeling and sampling the mood, not necessarily telling a story that had a beginning, a middle, and an end. It was just like suggesting something, working with suggestions, and slowly marching into a more structured and more cause-consequence narrative. So the second half is much more built on that artifice, not just the visual artifice, but also the artifice of the construction of the story itself. While the first prologue is more loose, I don't know.
The film is amazing, absolutely. Congratulations, everybody.
Thank you so much.
Great work. I was wondering, in Portugal, are children or school students taught about their colonial past in the schools? Because I learned recently, not a long time ago, that Great Britain doesn't. High schoolers or school students in Great Britain do not learn anything about their colonial past. And I was wondering if there was some level of education regarding Portugal's history with the colonies?
From what I know, there's a big shame in Portugal about the past history, and a big effort, a conscious and continuous effort from the youth, from the younger generations to, make it right somehow, to rename things, to invert the course that history took. And while it was slightly biased, when I was in high school, the way it was taught, it was devoid of a moral conclusion. At the moment, there's no such a thing. So everybody's pretty much aware of this burden of this inheritance. Everybody except exactly the people that were saying that somehow seem to be interested in bringing back these ideas, which I think is almost like a necessary evil. You cannot have 5 steps of evolution without having 3 of retrocess. And in particular, in Portugal, I think that while many people, I would say probably, I wouldn't say this film is necessarily about Portugal. I would say that probably my original idea and my intention was that anyone in the audience could somehow understand what was there, that people could relate this to the Vietnam War or to the Algiers War, to Iraq, without necessarily needing the clutch of factual history to understand, oh, this was like this, and this happened because there was this party in this country. Keeping it somehow adaptable to anyone's observation was important for us. Yeah?
Sorry to interrupt, just to add something, because I am a father of 2 children, and I have to deal with that in a fairly day-to-day basis. And I have to tell you that, unfortunately, we still have a long way to go in terms of making sure that names are. It's not only names. I mean, we still have problems even in last week or last month or something, in a history book there was enslaved people were itemized in a series of commodities that were traded with the shipping system that Portugal was using by the 16th century, more or less. So from the century on. So unfortunately, we have still a way to go. And for example, I read in the Guardian had the English newspaper had an article about how this newspaper was founded on money from slavery and from slave trade, and we are still very far away from major newspaper in Portugal doing this because of I don't know, my backwards thinking, I don't know, lack of education or.
And I think, besides everything they said, one thing that happens in Portugal is when you teach kids about past history of Europe, what happens is we teach our kids that colonialism is bad, but the other guys were bad. Portugal was not that bad, but. So the other ones were bad, but Portugal, no, we were not that bad. We were.
Moderate narrative.
Yeah, I think that narrative starts with Salazar, Portugal's equivalent to Franco and to Mussolini, who himself defined himself as not as bad as Hitler, not as bad as Franco. Portugal was not going to get involved in the Second World War. Portugal was not like the other colonist countries that had incredibly severely culture shocks between oppressed and the oppressors. So there was always this idea, no, Portugal is not as bad as the others. And it kind of, somehow there's still that, the prevalence of that idea. But one episode that happened, I would say perhaps a year before we shot the film, and to me was crucial to, first to make a few direct references in the film, but also to understand the importance of making the film in the way it's made, was the fact that there was a very popular and talked about racial crime in Lisbon, in which this old, ancient military, this ancient, I'm sorry, so my head today is, this ancient officer from the Portuguese army from 50 years ago kept bullying this African Portuguese actor during the first lockdown when he was walking his dog in the neighborhood. He kept saying, bullying him because of the dog and saying racist slurs to him and threatening him. And one day he said, "I'm going to kill you with the guns that I brought from overseas." Overseas, the expression that was used 50 years ago to refer to the colonies. And he did that. He went home, got the guns, shot this man, and then went to the police to give himself. I mean, this is this sort of racial crime. It doesn't come out of nowhere. There's something seriously behind it, seriously in need of being addressed and being resolved behind it. I don't believe that this is a crime that exists exclusively in Portugal, but this is why I think it's important to talk about it.
And also just speaks to how relatable this film is beyond Portugal.
Hopefully, yeah. But
no, absolutely. I mean, I'm afraid we are out of time. We have to clear this theater for another screening. But thank you all so much for the film.
Well, I want to thank everyone here for staying and for talking to us.